They built and ran 5 mills, shipping flour and meal down the James River to Richmond and beyond. They raised tobacco, exporting it to London and on to a worldwide market through their own import-export firm based in Richmond. They built hotels and taverns for travelers passing through on the Buffalo Springs Turnpike. Today, Pedlar Mills looks like most towns we drive by, but for much of its history, it was an economic powerhouse, shipping goods to Richmond and then worldwide. This story is about the people of the Pedlar Valley. They lived their lives, raised families, and built a thriving town on the Pedlar River. We'll take a look at their successes, their failures, and their everyday lives as we take a ride in the country. Pedlar. The Pedlar River is born high in the mountains of Amherst County as a series of small springs. It gathers strength and grows as it combines with other streams on its journey through the mountains. As it enters the Pedlar Valley, it is matured into a river producing water and power for the small towns it passes. Pleasant View, Pura, Agricola, and Pedlar Mills would grow beside its waters. Its floods provided rich topsoil for the fields beside it, and its power fueled the mills that would define Pedlar Mills. The first settler in the Pedlar area, Trader Hughes, built the first permanent trading post beside Otter Creek around 1710. Isaac Davis would build his trading post farther south, where the Pedlar enters the James River on its way to Richmond. All that's left of the trading post that Trader Hughes built today is the base of the chimney, but you can almost imagine how it would have looked. Otter Creek is just a couple 100 feet away, close enough to get fresh water, but not close enough to flood his cabin during heavy rains. Then there are the Indian trading routes, which pass through this area. Indian, white, black, it didn't matter to Trader Hughes. He was a trader, and all were welcome. These men who loved to range the lone places over the next forested hill or mountain were as mixed a group as the mountain men of the Rockies who followed a century later. They ranged downward from the sons of cultured tidewater families to indentured servants. These sharp-eyed woodsmen charted the Indian paths that would make good roads for civilization, marked the game areas, and designated the land which was best for settling. They prepared the way for those who later came to make places in which to settle and live. Alfred Percy. Soon land grants began to fill out the Pedlar area, including one belonging to Captain Charles Ellis. Ellis Grant would become Red Hill. His farm and family connections in Richmond would be instrumental in trading agreements which would build Pedlar Mills into an economic powerhouse. Isaac Davis would add to his trading post with a farm, which would eventually be called Society Ridge. His great-grandson, John Dudley Davis, would become an important member of the Virginia legislature, and his grandson, George Pleasance, would become the principal of the Pedlar Mills School, as well as an amateur historian providing much of what we know about the day-to-day life in Pedlar Mills. The earliest settlers concentrated on establishing their farms and raising enough crops to feed their families. Soon the rich ground produced more than they could use, and new mills were built. By the 1820s, the slow trickle of people moving to the Pedlar area had become a steady stream. It's impossible to discuss the history of Pedlar Mills without mentioning the Ellis family. After his service in the French and Indian War, Captain Charles Ellis established a farm in Pedlar with a 973-acre land grant. Ellis's son Josiah took over running the farm at his death in 1759. He would serve in the Revolution, achieving the rank of major, and then go on to build a mill near the Pedlar River, as well as opening a mercantile in Pedlar Mills. The mercantile provided supplies for the residents of Pedlar, but it also provided a conduit for selling local farmers' goods to neighboring localities. Josiah Ellis traveled to represent the newly formed Pedlar Church in 1789. In 1799, a small frame building was built to house St. Luke's Episcopal Church. In 1826, the members met in a tobacco barn, and decided to replace their frame church building with a new brick church. This time, Josiah Ellis's son was called to collect subscriptions to build the new building. The subscription drive was successful, with the new church building completed early in the 1830s. Another son, Charles, moved to Richmond and apprenticed with John Allen at the highly successful firm owned by William Galt. After apprenticing, they formed the Ellis and Allen Mercantile, which sold goods in the Richmond area. As the business grew, they added an office in London, opening the door for trade with England as well. While Charles handled the Richmond side of the business, Josiah's sons Richard and John ran the mercantile in Pedlar Mills, with their goods shipped to Richmond for sale, and goods from Richmond shipped back up the James to supply the residents of Pedlar Mills. The success of this arrangement allowed Richard Ellis to build Red Hill on Captain Charles Ellis' original land grant in 1824. The house was large, and also allowed Charles Ellis and his family to spend summers in Pedlar Mills, away from the heat of Richmond. John Allen and his family often accompanied them. While there isn't any conclusive proof, it is believed that Allen's stepson, Edgar Allan Poe, also visited with them. Poe would go on to become one of America's premier writers, and would maintain a friendship with the Ellis family through much of his life. Ellis and Allen and the Ellis family would continue their partnership with Pedlar, and that jump start would give the farmers and merchants in Pedlar the connections and clout they needed to continue growing. The Ellis family would forever be intertwined with Pedlar Mills, and both would thrive from the partnership. Born in 1801, John Dudley Davis was at times a farmer, a member of the Virginia legislature, and a leader in the Pedlar Mills community. The great-grandson of Isaac Davis, he lived at Society Ridge, and later Haywood, on the family's original land grant. His travels took him to many of the states east of the Mississippi, and he often wrote to his sister describing his adventures. Luckily, some of these letters have survived. On his death, newspapers broke the news to the public.
It is seldom a public journalist is called upon to chronicle the death of one so prominently connected with the social and political history of the time, and never has the announcement of the death of a more genial gentleman, warmer friend, or patriotic citizen been made than that of John Dudley Davis.
5 miles north of Pedlar Mills, the Buffalo Springs Resort was established just after the Revolutionary War. Natural warm springs credited with healing powers drew people from an ever wider area. Some came for the healing powers, some out of curiosity, and some, like John Dudley Davis, for a more social experience.
I have just arrived at home from the Buffalo Springs, where I spent the last week very pleasantly in company with a large concourse of ladies and gentlemen who are assembled at that place from this and some of the adjacent country. The number of visitors is considerably greater than I have ever known before at that place, and it is but justice to say that I have rarely seen so great a collection of beauty and intelligence at any place. There being no boarding house, each family furnished itself, so that the lot around the spring has very much the appearance of an encampment. The living is excellent, and the hospitality unbounding. Indeed, the only care which I experienced during my stay was the difficulty in framing apologies to innumerable invitations to breakfast, dinner, and sup with the different housekeepers. The amusements of the place were not, however, exactly as I would have preferred. Being almost entirely of a religious sort, dancing was strictly forbidden. Nor can I say much in commendation of the drinking departments. One julep, and one only, was my week's allowance. John Dudley Davis.
In the 1830s, a tavern and hotel were built at the Springs. It is not known if the 1 mint julep rule remained in place. The popularity of Buffalo Springs fostered a steady stream of travelers to the Springs. Pedlar Mills had an established stage stop on the road between Lynchburg and Buffalo Springs, and travelers appreciated the little town's hospitality. The road, however, was little more than a trail, and travel could range from uncomfortable to out-and-out painful.
Do you remember a certain citizen of Amherst County? Do you remember the tone, the style, the manner and matter of his conversations generally? And above all, do you remember their interminable length? If you do remember them, and you cannot have forgotten them, you have only to imagine, sorely afflicted with the headache, the heartache, and 1,000 other aches, real and imaginary, boxed up in a stagecoach with the aforesaid gentleman, the solitary victim of his concentrated powers in their most vigorous exercise, and you will have some faint idea of the unutterable bliss of 4 days' travel over the Blue Ridge, the North Mountains, the Allegheny, the 2 Sewells, and not to mention hills without number, watercourses without bridges, taverns without accommodation, and the other 1,000 ills to which flesh and blood is heir. But no tongue can tell, neither hath it entered into the heart of man to conceive the happiness of an escape from such a bliss. Thanks to my stars, I did escape. From Guyandonteo to St. Louis, my trip was made on the steamboat Swiss Boy, and was in the main comfortable. John Dudley Davis.
By the 1830s, the need for a better road between Lynchburg and Buffalo Springs was apparent. Virginia's chief engineer, Claudius Crozet, was tasked with designing the new Buffalo Springs Turnpike. The new road was a leap forward, and the flow of people traveling it continued to grow. There was a tavern near the stage stop in Pedlar Mills, and as the flow of travelers on the turnpike increased, it was joined by other businesses to support the needs of the town and the steady flow of guests. In 1835, Pedlar Mills boasted a store, 1 merchant mill, a tavern, a tailor shop, a tannery, 1 physician, and 56 residents. The new brick building for St. Luke's Episcopal Church was complete, and the future of Pedlar Mills was bright. For farmers, spring is a time of new possibilities. In the Pedlar Valley, spring meant spring planting. Fields were plowed and seeds carefully planted in the rich soil. In the mountains above the valley, peach trees began to bloom, with apples not far behind. Each bloom carries the promise of crops to feed hungry families, with a few extra to sell. As farmers watch the first leaves of plants venture above the ground, or the first blooms of fruit trees bursting out of the buds of winter, they begin a relationship with these plants. The weather is a vital partner, especially at this time of year. A late frost will destroy the tender blooms on the trees and kill the budding plants. Spring rains nourish the new crops planted in the valleys, but too much rain and the crops can be washed away. Too little and nothing can grow. The dance between a farmer, his crops, and nature will play out through spring, into the long hot summer days, and finally into fall with the last harvests. When one suffers, so will the other. And as one grows and flourishes, the other will as well. Soon the abundance of flour, grain, and tobacco raised by the farms needed to be put to use. Farmers were already partnered with local mercantiles who shipped their goods down the James River on the popular bateau in use at the time. A warehouse was built near Isaac Davis's original trading post, where the Pedlar joins the James River, so goods could be stored waiting for transport. With the completion of the James River and Kanawha Canal around 1840, packet boats could be used to transport even more goods on a regular schedule. Goods were ferried across the James River on the Perch Rope Ferry, where they were loaded onto the boats. Eventually, the canal and packet boats were replaced by the railroad. The Perch Rail Station at the mouth of Pedlar River moved a steady stream of goods to eager customers. Pedlar River and Horsley's Creek joined together right in the middle of Pedlar Mills, and swinging bridges were built across them to connect the houses and businesses in the town. For large loads, carts pulled by oxen, mules, or horses were pulled over the shallow section of the river. One such cart became stuck midstream, causing a commotion.
Mr. Eubank, are you stuck?
Get up, Lou.
Oh, Mr. Eubank. Get up, you. Get up.
Mr. Eubank, I believe you are stuck.
Go on, woman. Go on and shut up. Get up. Get up, you.
Perhaps I could call from the bank and entice your mule over.
Go on. Many a yoke of oxen and mule have been drowned by a woman's damn long tongue.
Mr. Eubank eventually crossed the river. No enticement from the bank was necessary. The Ellis family had established Ellis and Allen in Richmond, acting as both a mercantile and an agent for import-export across the East Coast, and with the establishment of their London office, international trade. With a steady flow of goods shipping to Richmond, the mills increased production, and Pedlar Mills continued to grow.
This story, I feel, is not without value as a contribution to the history of the times of which I speak. I have placed facts and incidents which otherwise would be lost. A record of daily life of the people at the time. George Pleasance.
With these words, George Pleasance gives us a view into life in Pedlar Mills. Pleasance was an amateur historian, in addition to his duties as principal at the Pedlar Mills School. Before his death in 1963, he documented the stories handed down from those who had lived in Pedlar Mills during the 19th and early 20th centuries. These stories were shared in a paper that was included in the Pedlar Mills scrapbook.
The first merchant mill at Pedlar Mills was at the mouth of Miners Branch. 80 years ago, some of the old timber could be seen in the banks of the Pedlar River. The second mill was located where Carrington Gillespie's home is, known as the mill site. The third mill was built during or just after the war between the states by Mr. Hazel Williams. This mill was located on the west side of Pedlar River, some 200 yards above the mouth of Horsley's Creek. This was a very imposing building for this date. It was some 5 stories high and built of the very best material to be had at that time. George Pleasance.
Hazel Williams led a group of investors named the Ivanhoe Group in building the big mill at a cost of $10,000, equivalent to $366,000 in today's dollars. At 5 stories tall, it stood over the town, providing capacity for even larger exports of flour and grain.
About 1900, a great quantity of wheat was raised in Pedlar Valley, more than the big mill could grind. So Messrs. Sam and Pomp Turner built a mill almost as large as the big mill, about 100 yards above the site of the second mill. George Pleasance.
Farmers had also found that the rich soil produced excellent crops of tobacco. The tobacco was shipped to Ellis and Allen and then on to London, where an eager public sought out the mild Virginia tobacco. As the town continued to grow, the tavern took on more importance. It afforded rooms, meals, and a drink for weary travelers, but soon included official meetings, trials, a doctor's office, and anything else the growing community required.
Dr. Keith had his office in the tavern. A farmer himself, he knew the life could be hard. Farming was hard work, and regular meals were sometimes a luxury during the growing season. Dr. Keith always kept a pot of soup simmering on the stove outside his office. After taking care of his patients' medical needs, he would tell them to be sure and get a bowl of soup before leaving. For some patients, that might have been their first hot meal that day. All doctors have difficult cases, and one patient didn't respond to his treatment. Despite his best efforts, Robert Williams died while under his care. Dr. Keith believed that he should have recovered and couldn't forgive himself for the loss. He gave up medicine and vowed never to practice medicine again. He gave up his office in the tavern and concentrated on running his farm. His loyal patients had other ideas. While the location changed from the tavern to his house, they kept coming to him with their ailments. After protesting that he didn't practice anymore, he'd eventually give in and take care of them, like he always had, but he refused to take any money for his efforts. Again, his patients had other ideas. They would slip some money on the table as they left his office, after having a bowl of the hot soup that he kept simmering on the old stove. 3 out of 5 stores sold whiskey along with general merchandise. In addition to the stores, there were 2 blacksmith shops, 1 saddle and harness shop, and the tannery operated by Bill Tucker. 1 distillery run by Armstead Fagans. They would make your brandy from your apples, 1 gallon of brandy for every 11 bushels of apples. Later, the building was used as a cannery by Ellis and Woods. The post office at this date was in Albert Paget's store. He could tell you what every postal card was about. Once, Miss Nanny Tapscott stopped by to get her mail on her way home. He told her the mail had already been sent to her home, and she got a postcard, but he had been too busy to read it, so he could not tell her what it was about. George Pleasance.
After working hard all week, folks needed some time to unwind. There were church services at St. Luke's, socializing in town, or maybe just a quiet afternoon with a friend.
In those days, around 600 people lived in the immediate vicinity of Pedlar Mills. The majority of these people gathered there on Saturday evenings for a friendly get-together, to discuss current affairs, to watch the drunks fuss and fight, and to spend the few pennies which they had accumulated during the week. The amusements consisted of community dances, tournaments, quilting parties, picnics, dinners, and box suppers. Hitching posts were along each side of the road, because this was horse and buggy days. The bottom, owned by the Tompkins, was also used as a circus ground. The John Robinson Circus traveled on foot, and they had certain places they stopped and gave performances. This bottom was used for the Pedlar Valley Circus. Transportation in town was by walking or horseback, but for longer trips, travelers used the stagecoach and riverboats. George Pleasance.
By the 1890s, Pedlar Mills included a distillery, a dentist, 5 general stores, a hotel, a tavern, a millwright, 3 doctors, a saddlery, a tannery, an undertaker, a private school, 3 sawmills, 4 flour mills, a constable, 2 blacksmith shops, and 600 citizens.
The Pedlar Mills post office was one of the smallest as well as one of the oldest in Amherst County. It existed for over 150 years. The first postmaster was John Ellis, who served from 1807 to 1814. It was on July 1st, 1925, that Rennie M. Brown first obtained the contract for carrying the mail between Knoll and Pedlar Mills. Brown used about 5 horses on his route during those years. Old Bill traveled the route about 8 years, and before him came Prince, Nell, Mary, and Maud. They all learned to head up to and stop at the mailboxes. Old Bill got in the habit of always stopping at the top of Mitchell's Hill before he went down. That was because Brown generally dismounted and walked down in the wintertime in order to keep warm. Only once in the 31 years was he unable to make the run. That was during the winter of 1948, when a blizzard kept him in the house. For more than 31 years, Daddy rode horseback over the same route, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. The route he traveled is not passable at one point by automobile. A ford crosses the Pedlar River, and it's too deep for a car to travel. But his horse had no trouble. Doris Brown Todd.
As the turn of the century rolled around, the Pedlar Valley continued its success, but changes were coming. The road through Pedlar Mills continued to improve, making it easier to travel to nearby towns like Monroe and Lynchburg, which offered easier access to the railroads. In the 1920s and 30s, cars and trucks started to appear on the old stage road. What had been a 2-day round trip to Lynchburg with a horse and wagon shrunk to a few hours with a car. Cars and trucks could simply travel longer distances faster, and the world around Pedlar Mills began to shrink. Pedlar Mills was never incorporated as a town. It grew as new businesses were needed. In 1860, the hotel at Buffalo Springs Resort burned and wasn't rebuilt. The Ellis family had grown with the Pedlar Valley, eventually owning Red Hill as well as the 6 farms surrounding it. But as 1850 approached, their fortunes were fading too. Ellis and Allen had closed its offices in Richmond, and they began selling the farms to make ends meet. In 1853, Red Hill was sold. When the mercantile owned by the Ellis family closed, the books would show $60,000 in credit given to their neighbors in Pedlar to help them through the tough times. There'd been no need to pressure them to pay. They knew they would pay them when they could. Red Hill would not be part of the Ellis family again until 1898, when John Ellis would bring back some of the Ellis legacy. His contracts with the railroad had built a successful business providing them with lumber. He bought back Red Hill and even a few of the surrounding farms, and for a while it was restored to its former grandeur. Once again, neighbors were invited to Red Hill for lavish parties and events, but the success wouldn't last. In 1911, a fire destroyed the wheat crop stored in the large barn. Following that, there was a slowdown in lumber orders for the railroad. Finally, in 1912, he was forced to sell Red Hill. His lumber business would recover, and he would remain in Pedlar Mills. It was said that he would often ride by Red Hill, sometimes stopping by to visit the new owners, and for a while, to be in the place that it meant so much to his family.
For many years, Mr. Ellis was a commanding figure astride his great horse, Jim, familiar in the neighborhood and known to all. Although few perhaps understood what this area really meant to him. The end finally came as Mr. Ellis rode down the road that leads to Red Hill. He toppled from the saddle, probably dead from a heart attack or stroke. He was found a little later, Big Jim standing quietly by. Mr. Ellis would have wanted it that way. He was an Ellis, and he fell within sight of the bottom on Round Top and the forest at Red Hill.
As the new century wore on, the businesses in Pedlar Mills continued to decline. Turner's Mill burned in 1920, followed by the Big Mill in 1938. Neither was replaced. With larger towns within driving distance, the businesses that had helped Pedlar Mills thrive had outlived their usefulness. As owners retired, there wasn't anyone to replace them, and the old buildings either became houses or were abandoned. The mercantiles which had provided for much of the town's needs became outdated, as their customers began to travel to nearby towns to shop at larger stores. In the early 1950s, the last 2 mercantiles and the last of Pedlar Mills' businesses closed their doors for good. This country is littered with ghost towns that simply disappeared when the businesses dried up. But that didn't happen in the Pedlar Valley. The businesses closed, but the people stayed. They liked their lives in the little valley, and the car meant they could work and shop in the larger towns nearby, but still live in Pedlar. Farmers bought trucks to carry their goods to the railheads in nearby towns. The residents of Pedlar saw the same thing that the earliest settlers saw. The beauty of the mountains, the Pedlar River softly rolling by on its way to the James, and a community of friends and neighbors who celebrated the good times together and helped each other through the hard times. In 1921, Reverend Josiah Richard Ellis, the great-great-grandson of Captain Charles Ellis, took over the position as minister of St. Luke's Episcopal Church. He was very aware of his family's relationship with the church and the town of Pedlar Mills. He quickly made his mark on the church by revitalizing the congregation and replacing the small front porch with a portico across the front of the building. The church grew over the next decade under his leadership, but he was getting older. And in 1929, his family thought he should move to Richmond to be closer to family there. Pedlar didn't have many of the comforts and medical facilities available in a city the size of Richmond. As he struggled with the decision, he wrote a few words to help him with his thoughts. I like to think he stopped at St. Luke's, the church he and his family worked so hard to found and nurture. He might have looked over at the town they had helped build, and that had shaped so much of his family's life. Then I like to think he might have walked over to the riverbank to say goodbye to an old friend.
It runs and it flows as onward it goes to add to the depth of the sea, and its clear waters, sweet as they flow at my feet, arouse the old memories in me, though often away forever and aye in its hurrying down to the sea. It minds me of ways in the old gladsome days when in youth its music I tended, and love did its worst in mystic and verse to those whom its wavelets befriended. And others before did likewise adore thee and sing of thee, dear Pedlar River, whose waters to them were always a gem and gifts of the Almighty Giver. On thee heretofore, in glad days of yore, ancestors looked on for a day, then came to abide thy waters beside, from Tuckahoe Creek far away to Pedlar. Friends came from afar, made it home as they swung to the sweet terpsichore. Lad and lass, now away, dead many a year, to list to thy waves nevermore. And now we must part, so saddened heart. With tears I bid thee farewell, as like all the rest, having given my best in other climes I'm to dwell. But anon and ever I'll think of thee, river, and hold thee in fond memory, through sorrow and joy, as time with me toys, with my face too set to the sea.